Filipinos are going to hate us for the rest of time immemorial. This has to be up them. Independence is coming up in a couple of months. I'm going to turn them over to Rojas, and Rojas can do with them what he wants to. This is the Filipino question. MacArthur lays it right out, messages right in there. You'll be able to read it. So eloquent as to why the United States has to back the Philippines, can't act like they are the dominator, can't act like they are the dictator to the Philippines. MacArthur comes down for independence, meets with Rojas and Malacañang, and they decide, okay, now Vargas, Laurel, they'll come back to the Philippines. Now the whole time, Vargas, Laurel, all of them are denouncing Douglas MacArthur. You know, he's the one keeping us here. He's the one not telling us what's going on, but he really is the guy who saves him from the radical politicians back in Washington. Rojas writes MacArthur right after independence, says send him back down. MacArthur does. Osmania has that People's Court going. It's still going. They've been completely worried in Japan because they heard about Secretary of Defense Teofilo Sison's trial and conviction. Laurel comes back, master of constitutional law. He'll be able to deal with anything that's thrown at him. And his big thing is when Truman decorates Wainwright back in the United States with a 4th star as well as the Medal of Honor, Truman says, you were the sacrifice for America's unpreparedness. And this becomes the crux of Laurel's case. None of that collaboration would have happened if America had been prepared and protected us. We were the American protectorate. Besides, all the Philippines was a concentration camp. Everybody will understand that. January of '48, the trial doesn't come to an end. Rojas grants amnesty to everyone. A lot of speculation as to what that means to the Philippines, but I'm an archivist. I just tell you what I've seen. 1954, Laurel goes to the States. He's been chosen by Magsaysay to go create the new trade deal. Calls up MacArthur. I want to come see you. MacArthur, yeah, I want to see you too. They get together, 1954. Private meeting. Associated Press writes MacArthur, hey, what happened in that meeting? MacArthur, ignore it. This is between us, nobody else. But Laurel will come out and say that MacArthur had told him when he shows up in the Philippines, he had the orders to arrest everyone. But he said he never considered them traitors. You know, they did what they had to do. And Laurel, afterward, we've got the messages, once again, right over there, sends him a box of cigars. Smoke them up on me, General! 1961, MacArthur comes back to the Philippines, the Sentimental Tour, given an honorary Doctor of Laws at Lyceum University. Makes this speech saying how great he thinks the university is building up the Filipino youth. Nothing but flattering praise. So Darryl Laurel is the one who invited him, and they'll have correspondence that goes on after that. So that's it. That's my report. Like I said, in leaving these materials at the Lyceum University, I hope it helps. You know, there's a lot of books out about this issue, and there's a lot of misinformation about what happened and what was. A lot of it's cleared up by this stuff. Now, I can be reached any day. www.macarthurmemorial.org. You can get a hold of me on Facebook. It's a social media world now. I'm a touch away. As well, for the Lyceum University, we have Skype programs. We can do classrooms from the United States to the Philippines. And we can make all of this available to everyone. Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it. Hope you all have a great day. Thanks.
As promised, let me turn over the microphone and the podium now to Dr. Ferdinand Aurelius Juan. She is going to do the moderation over there, from there, and my job is done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. Thank you.
Thank you to our MC, Mr. Santos, and thank you to our guest speaker, Mr. James Obel. I'm Rino Aurelios of the History Department of De La Salle University, Manila, and my role for today is to become the moderator for this open forum. Now, we have 3 gentlemen here. Actually 4, I'm the only female here. But we have 3 distinguished gentlemen who would like to share their insights and reactions to the topic tackled by our guest speaker. Now, our first reactor will share with us, in order to complement the topic delivered by James Obel, he will share with us important insights on the relationship between Laurel and MacArthur, I think before and during the war. So to add more to that, I'm proud that he was my former professor at the University of the Philippines. Currently, also the director of the Third World Studies Center. Foremost historian of World War II in the Philippines, author of numerous books, journal articles on the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, the Pacific War, diplomatic and military history. So this is Dr. Rico Jose.
First of all, thanks for having me here. Thank you and congratulations, Jim, for that excellent presentation. I'm not going to try to repeat most of what you laid the overall framework, so I'm not going to repeat or not going to go into too much of that. Instead, when I looked at the program, I got it the other day, I think, and saw that I was not a reactor, but I was a panelist. I began to wonder why I was separated from the other 2, and that meant probably I thought I had to prepare something else. And so yesterday I got my notes together and did try to prepare something else. As I prepared it, I gave it the tentative title, Crossing Paths, because President Laurel and General MacArthur did cross paths personally on several occasions. Here we have 2 giants in Philippine history in a very significant historical period. Laurel being a legal luminary, a political leader, MacArthur being a military legend, and the 2 of them crossed paths a number of times. As mentioned by Jim, the period before the war is rather sketchy. I've looked at the papers in the MacArthur Memorial, and indeed most of the important papers were lost. But there were a number of interesting points where their paths must have crossed. Firstly, when the National Defense Plan was being drafted in its earlier days of execution, when MacArthur was here as military advisor to the Commonwealth, Laurel was then Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and MacArthur was, of course, military advisor to the Philippine government. At this point, there were many legal issues that came up regarding the defense plan. Whether, in fact, the government could require Filipinos to report for service, whether the budget was enough, and so on and so forth. And Laurel, being Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, would have had to tackle some of these issues. So it is beyond doubt that they would have met on several occasions. In fact, after the war, when they met in 1954, it was said that Laurel and MacArthur were good friends. There's a second point also before the war, when MacArthur would have become intimately related with MacArthur, and this was when Jose P. Laurel's son, the second son, Jose Sotero Laurel III, went to Japan to study at the Imperial Military Academy. Upon his return, he became a regular officer of the Philippine Army, but not after a lot of arm twisting and talking to people in power. So once again, Laurel and MacArthur would have met on this occasion. When war was imminent, in July 1941, and the USAFE was formed, Jim has said that Laurel sent a letter of congratulations to MacArthur. But also, Laurel writes in his war memoirs that Laurel offered his services to the USAFE himself. The letter has probably been lost, but Laurel said that he offered his services as a justice and felt that he would be useful in the Judge Advocate General's department, which he probably would have, in fact, been a very important figure. Unfortunately, Laurel was needed in the Supreme Court and later on became part of Quezon's war cabinet. As a member of Quezon's cabinet, Laurel attended the meetings in Marikina, sometimes with air raid warnings in progress. MacArthur is known to come to Marikina once. The photograph that was taken of MacArthur in Marikina was taken on December 17, 1941. And I checked both Sutherland's office record and the MacArthur diary for that period, and indeed, it says MacArthur visits, but no other comments. In fact, the publicity statement said we are not giving any publicity to this. So MacArthur does go, attends the meeting on December 17. Laurel is there. The photograph actually would show him on the extreme left. So they met there. Of course, we don't know what they discussed at that point. After the 17th, there were many cabinet meetings before Quezon would leave for Corregidor. And as Jim mentioned, Quezon asked Laurel initially to accompany Quezon to Corregidor. But the next day, he changed his mind and told Quezon to stay put and instead deal with the Japanese when they came in. At this point, Laurel raised the question, if he was going to stay and Vargas and the others were going to stay, what were they going to do when the Japanese came? And Quezon told Vargas to ask MacArthur. At this point, the story becomes a little confused, depending on who you read. But the point is that it seems that what happened was Quezon asked Vargas to call MacArthur. And MacArthur was indeed called by Vargas. And what Vargas is told, many people have said essentially the same thing. The question posed to MacArthur was, what do we do when the Japanese come? And the standard answer, which Laurel, Recto, and a few others would remember, the answer was, what can you do under the circumstances? You have to do what they ask you to do except one thing, taking the oath of allegiance to Japan. This appears in several war memoirs, not only Laurel's war memoirs, but also Quintin Paredes' report after the war, and a number of other sources immediately after the war. Even Rojas's brief summary of his activities mentions this as well. And I'll go back to this. Remember, it is a telephone conversation, not a personal meeting. Vargas calls MacArthur, and MacArthur gives him this word. There's another version of this, which came out in the 1944 issue of Colliers Magazine, which was a little more dramatic. This was written by an American journalist by the name of Royal Ark Gunnison. And he says that essentially you have some tough decisions to make, etc. But what MacArthur added was, if you take an oath of allegiance to Japan, we will shoot you when we come back. So it becomes a little more dramatic. But this is war news. It comes out in a war magazine, so there is probably some censorship there. Quezon also admits in his The Good Fight that he instructed Vargas and Laurel and the others to stay and soften the blow, although he did not say that MacArthur had a role. This is a major meeting, or the major instance where MacArthur and Laurel had this particular notice and this particular information. The second point that I would like to stress perhaps is, again, between MacArthur and Laurel, was the arrest of Laurel after the war. In September 15, 1945, Laurel, Vargas, etc. were arrested by the U.S. Army and brought to Yokohama's Kamioka prison, later brought to Sugamo after that. This was something that, interestingly enough, was something that caused some of those arrested to be very angry. And when they found out this was MacArthur's doing, they were particularly mad at MacArthur. Vargas writes in his diary that he was cursing and cursing MacArthur. Benigno Aquino Sr. was also equally colorfully cursing MacArthur. Laurel did not curse MacArthur. It seems Laurel knew something else, or he was more of a diplomat or more of a gentleman. They stayed in Tokyo until July 23, 1946. And many of them asked, and some of their supporters after the war would ask, why did MacArthur keep them so late? Why did MacArthur not return them right after the war? Or why did they not return them right after independence? It was July 23, 1946, so they stayed in Sugamo prison for quite some time. Nobody understood the reasons until much later. Jim has mentioned some of that. MacArthur felt he was protecting them from the United States, particularly Secretary Ickes, who wanted vengeance, very strict vengeance, and nobody, of course, would have understood that specifically in Sugamo, because all of this was being done behind closed doors. Now, another incident where MacArthur and Laurel crossed paths was in 1951. Not personally, but through an article written by an American journalist, Frederick Marquardt, who wrote an article, MacArthur on Laurel. This was published in the Philippines Free Press on July 28, 1951. It claimed that MacArthur saved Laurel from being hung by angry Filipinos by intervening and keeping him safe from these vengeful Filipinos. Indeed, the mood in the Philippines right after the war was something where people were being killed, in fact, without trial. Marquardt quoted MacArthur as saying, if we hanged Laurel, we would have drawn a line of blood between the American and Filipino peoples that would never have been erased. The people who were kind of demanding that the collaborators be charged and hanged were people like Ickes and perhaps some of the more radical guerrilla leaders of the time. If we look at this particular period when the article comes out, July 1951, by this time MacArthur has been removed from power. He has already been sent back to the United States. And also by this time, 1951, it was obvious that Laurel was back in position, rising as a very prominent Filipino politician. Recto immediately countered Marquardt's article. And since Recto was Laurel's defense counsel in the People's Court, stated that there was no foundation in law or history that MacArthur did save Laurel's life, saying essentially that Laurel owed MacArthur nothing. Recto pointed out to some details in the Marquardt article. Laurel could have been killed, could not have been killed like the other collaborators in Europe, and there were technical mistakes in the article. He pointed out a number of items. Marquardt said that Wang Qingwei, the Chinese puppet president, was killed by his own people after the war. It was not true. Wang Qingwei died in Japan while undergoing a hospital operation. So Recto tries to bring out another point. But again, this is not between Laurel and MacArthur personally. So one asks, did Marquardt report MacArthur correctly? Or was there something else behind this? Again, this is Cold War, the Cold War period. MacArthur has just been removed from Korea and brought to the United States. And so there's probably a little more behind it that we don't know. Interesting would be the meeting that Laurel and MacArthur had on October 10, 1954. That's the picture that we have here. Laurel was in the United States to negotiate the Laurel-Langley Agreement, but while in the United States, he made it a point to go to New York and to meet with MacArthur. It would be their first meeting since December 17, 1941. They had never seen each other since that meeting in Marikina. According to one report, MacArthur apologized to Laurel for imprisoning him in Tokyo. He explained the situation. Ickes explained that MacArthur himself understood that Laurel was following Quezon's own instructions. It was a more diplomatic explanation, it would seem, long after the war, and probably not reflecting what MacArthur had actually felt during the war. But by this time, both Laurel and MacArthur were several years behind the war, and MacArthur would say that he had to follow the pressure from Washington and London, as a matter of fact. Laurel, gentleman that he was, replied that he did not bear a grudge against MacArthur and did not say anything against MacArthur, unlike the others. MacArthur then talked about Laurel's mission in the United States, how important it was, and supported Laurel and advised him to see the top government officials in the United States. They then said goodbye and never saw each other again. One interesting point after this is that although Laurel and MacArthur saw each other in 1954, 7 years later, in 1961, MacArthur would write historian David Steinberg and say, quote, "I gave no instructions to Santos, Rojas, Laurel, or any other Filipino leader on leaving the Philippines to assume command of the Southwest Pacific area with headquarters in Australia. There was no so-called Filipino delegation. Every Filipino except those in the armed services acted according to his own conscience as far as I know." This was a handwritten letter signed personally by MacArthur. If one looks at this a little more closely, it is correct because, one, there was indeed no Filipino delegation that saw MacArthur. It was a telephone call. And again, it's correct technically because MacArthur did not give any instructions when he left the Philippines for Australia, because he had given the instructions in December 1941 when he left Manila for Corregidor. So if one picks the details, the letter is correct. And yet, there are second meanings behind it all. So one looks at these letters and perhaps on rereading the letter, perhaps one should consider also what Steinberg had asked what Steinberg had asked MacArthur in the first place, because one will respond to the way a letter is written, a question is written. Now, MacArthur visited the Philippines in a sentimental voyage in July 1961, but by that time, Laurel and Recto and many of the other key leaders were gone. They had passed away, and Laurel and MacArthur's paths would never cross again. But, as we've seen, the Lyceum of the Philippines awarded MacArthur an honoris causa degree, which meant that, at least in spirit, Laurel and MacArthur were still crossing paths. MacArthur himself passed away in 1964, and with that marked the end of an era, and the crossing of paths ends forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that enlightening insight, Dr. Jose. Now, our second reactor is a world-renowned historian, economist, and book author. I'm sure that many of us have read his books. Former Deputy Governor for Economic Research of the Central Bank of the Philippines, Dr. Benito Legarda Jr.
Thank you very much. I don't know about it being world-renowned, but at least I know some people read my books. Maybe not everyone. I know almost nothing about the subject of MacArthur and Laurel. Instead, I will address the question from the point of view of impressions of Laurel and the collaboration issue. Let me say in advance that I may not be the most objective person. My mother ran on the same ticket as Dr. Laurel in the 1949 elections. My uncle, General Basilio, Chief of Staff of the Philippine Army, was very pro-Laurel. So I will in fact bring up some things which I would ordinarily not bring up, just to counterbalance my own personal biases. During the occupation, people were not quite sure what to think of Laurel. Barbershop talk was Laurel, si Laurel, pakiling-kiling. He was swaying from side to side, which meant that he was not really bending completely to one side or the other. For people of my age, for people in our late teens, one big advantage, one big benefit that Laurel gave was he avoided conscription. which means to say he avoided getting us into Japanese uniforms and fighting on the side of the Japanese. That was a great thing, I think. The late Justice Isabagani A. Cruz, who was a companion of mine in our youth, mentions this repeatedly. He was an admirer of Laurel. Another incident that comes to me, this is a private incident related to me by Tomas Ford, his American mestizo from Capiz, who was living in the Rojas household. He said that one day Laurel came to visit Rojas, and he asked Rojas, "Can we speak freely?" And Rojas said, "Sure, sure." And Laurel then told him, "I cannot stand the pressure anymore. It is too much." And Rojas told him, "You have to stay, because if you leave, the Japanese will put somebody else who will be very bad for the country." It's possible that he was referring to Ricarte. Ricarte is a hero in his own right from 1899, but in 1942, history had bypassed him. And at that time, the Filipinos of the war generation regarded Ricarte with fear. They thought that if Ricarte was put in charge, he would turn the country over completely to the Japanese. Probably not just, but that was the impression. I'm relating impressions. And then when Laurel refused to declare war at first on America, but when the American raid started in September 21st, 1944, he had to do something. So he declared, I think with Recto's advice, he formulated he declared the existence of a state of war, not declared war, which meant we're fighting you, but the existence of a state of war, saying that there was fighting going on. And again, the people in Washington completely lost this. It's completely lost. These subtleties are completely lost on people in Washington. But it was picked up by every Filipino lawyer. They said, existence of the state of war. And all the lawyers I knew noticed that. Now, what could be on the debit side? Laurel saved a lot of people, Rojas among them, and one of them is Ambassador Perez Rubio, who's here, whose life he saved up in Baguio. But there was someone whose life he refused to save, and that was Liling Roses. Why, I do not know. But the Roses family, to this day, holds it against Laurel. That when they went to him to ask for his intervention, his reaction was, "Roses, isn't he a guerrilla?" So this is one red mark, you might say. Does not seem characteristic of the man, but it's happened. I pass it on to you. The other one is that a lot of people afterwards will say, if Laurel was not a collaborator, why are the Laurels so intimately associated with Japanese business interests after the war? Well, after the war, people did what they wanted, and I think the governing consideration here is what has been mentioned, that Laurel lived a very modest life. There was no ostentation, no luxury. It was really a very decent middle-class existence, so that if there were business connections, he certainly didn't make much money out of that. He maintained his decent middle-class lifestyle all throughout. So again, let me reiterate, my mother ran with President Laurel in the 49 elections. My uncle, General Basilio, who was present in Marikina in that December meeting, was also very pro-Laurel. So there you have it. There you have what I have to say.
Thank you. Our last reactor is currently